Catherine Amirfar.
And I'm Kal Raustiala.
And this is International Law Behind the Headlines, coming to you from
the American Society of International Law.
So welcome to another episode of International Law Behind the Headlines. I'm Kal Raustiala, and I have today a really special guest, Anu Bradford, who is the Henry L. Moses Professor of Law and International Organization at Columbia. And for our purposes, I should say at Columbia Law School, and for our purposes, she is here to talk about her new book called The Brussels Effect, which is a relatively deep dive and a really interesting read into the regulatory power of the European Union and how the European Union has become, in many ways, the most significant regulator in the world. And so I'm really pleased to have Anu here. We've known each other a while, and it's great to have you on the podcast, Anu.
Thanks so much, Kal. Good to be here.
Sure. So I thought what I could do is first just ask you about the Brussels effect and really just begin with a definition, which is, what does that mean? And can you give us a couple of salient examples?
Yeah, absolutely, Kal. So the Brussels effect refers to the European Union's ability to regulate the global marketplace and to do so unilaterally. So the European Union is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world. And there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in Europe. So in order to engage with the European market, they follow the European regulations. There's nothing surprising with that. But what is more interesting is that these companies often choose to apply the European regulations across their global production and operations. And they do so in order to avoid the cost of complying with multiple regulatory regimes. So by choosing to follow a uniform standard, and if that uniform standard is the most stringent standard in the world, which the EU standards often are, they can access all the markets around the world. So all the EU needs to do is to regulate the single market. And it is the global companies that then globalize those European rules.
Great, fantastic. So we're going to drill down a little bit on how this works in practice and sort of what areas we tend to see the Brussels effect and what areas we don't and so forth in a few minutes. But just to continue kind of setting the stage. So, I'm here in California. California has long been a pace setter within the United States in terms of regulation, let's say on air quality. And in fact, you talk in the book about the notion of the California effect being a kind of inspiration for your thinking. And then the contrasting kind of state or effect in the American context is the Delaware effect, which is usually viewed as more of a race to the bottom rather than a kind of race to the top. And so I'm curious how you see, I guess, two questions, how you see the Brussels effect differing from the way the California effect has been understood in American regulatory understandings. And then the second question is, what is the distinction with the Delaware effect, or how do we distinguish between races to the top and races to the bottom in a kind of neutral way? Is there a way to actually do that, or is this more of an eye of the beholder?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that the Brussels effect builds on the California effect, which documented this phenomenon in the US context. So you're right, California was a leader and has been in environmental regulation, and it had managed to then elevate the regulatory standards across the United States. You are a car manufacturer in Detroit, you want to sell cars in California, you need to follow those emission standards. But it would be too costly for you then to set up separate production lines and produce different types of cars for the rest of the United States, even if those other states had not elevated their standards as high as the California standards were. So David Fogel from Berkeley gave name, the California effect, to this phenomenon whereby we start seeing a race to the top. So these companies that follow the California rules then start advocating the same kind of rules in the rest of the United States because they are already complying with this kind of rules. And we see then the other state adjust their rules upwards to meet the California standards. And it is the opposite what happens with the Delaware effect, where people often describe we see a race to the bottom. that you have Delaware with very generous pro-shareholder corporate rules. And then we have other states who want to also persuade companies to register in their states. And then they have the incentives to try to compete with Delaware to have a very generous corporate rules. So this is the foundation of the debates on the regulatory races, whether we see a race to the top or whether we see the race to the bottom. What makes the Brussels effect different? So first of all, it is closer to the California effect. It builds on that, being often described as a race to the top or race to the regulatory stringency, but it describes what happens globally. So globally, the regulations come from the European Union today. It used to be much more, they came from the United States, but since 1990s, they have come from the EU. The Brussels effect goes a little bit further than the theory of the California effect by really giving a more nuanced theory of when this kind of race takes place. And it also focuses less on whether other states follow what the EU does. It really follows on the corporations around the world adjusting their behavior globally, even though they own states, they own governments around the world would not follow the suit and would not implement the EU type of rules. So what we may see is that we only see often the EU have the stringent regulatory standard in place. Other countries like the United States not adjusting its standards, but US companies like Google and Facebook following the EU standards of privacy also in the United States.
Great. So privacy is a wonderful example, and data issues. I think most listeners are probably familiar with the fact that now any website you go to, as a result of the GDPR regulation, they have to click something about cookies and so forth, and that's really the result of the EU regulation. And I think a kind of paradigmatic example of what you're talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think that is one of the most profound and most topical examples of the Brussels effect when you look at companies like Facebook and Google and Microsoft adopt the EU rules globally. And even then advocating, Mark Zuckerberg was advocating a federal legislation in the US that would be modeled according to the GDPR, something that Tim Cook from Apple was suggesting as well. So these US companies have also become advocates of the EU privacy rules. But Kal, I think privacy is a great example, but it's not the only one. We have other examples from digital economy. One topical example is hate speech online, where companies like Twitter and YouTube have adopted the EU's definition of hate speech, not the one that would come from the First Amendment of the US Constitution, when these companies decide what kind of speech they take down from their platforms. But then we see examples from environmental regulation. We see examples from consumer health and safety, including chemical regulation or food safety. So it's really something that cuts across many different industries, affecting many different companies in numerous markets around the world.
Yes. So I agree. Those are all, first of all, those are all things that you obviously cover in the book. And I think all really fantastic examples. And I want to, a little later, we'll turn to the issue of consumer facing, which seems to be an important through line. And I want to kind of understand a little more how you see that playing out. But just to stick for a moment to, let's say, to data and internet issues, because I think those are personally, to me, inherently interesting, but also great examples of what you're talking about and something everyone has kind of experienced in a very concrete way. So I guess conceptually, one question I have is so take hate speech, which you brought up. Is the Brussels effect about the most stringent regulation sort of being spread through this market dynamic? And how do we define stringency? Or is it about the most, I don't know, positive in some normative sense? Or what is it exactly that makes the hate speech standard that's used, that you just alluded to, an example of the Brussels effect? So break that down a little more.
Yeah, so generally it is about regulatory stringency, or it is about the regulation that is ambitious in the sense that when a company complies with that particular regulation, it also is in compliance with the regulations in the rest of the world. So if the EU tells that you cannot have this particular harmful chemical in your products, there are very few instances where another jurisdiction would demand that you need to, for instance, put asbestos into the product. So by leaving out the chemicals that are not prohibited in the EU, the products are produced in the way that contain the chemical composition that make them fit for the EU, but also fit for the rest of the world. So generally, it is about stringency. And maybe, Kal, to illustrate the difference, so there could be instances where the regulations are mutually incompatible. And that's when the Brussels effect doesn't work. So if you think about a classic trade dispute between the US and the EU, the EU does not accept that you would treat chicken with chlorine. And if the US wants you to treat chicken with chlorine in order to make it fit for the market, then it's hard to ask what is the most stringent regulation. There's not one regulatory standard that encompasses the other regulatory standards. But that's more typically, that's an aberration. So normally it is the EU's stringent standard that is more ambitious than the standards available that required by the other governments. But for instance, you ask about the hate speech. The EU is not the most stringent regulator of speech. We have authoritarian governments, including China, Russia, Iran, which have much more stringent speech rules online.
Right.
But the EU is the most stringent, yet still acceptable to the companies, to the extent that the companies are willing to abide by those rules.
So if we were to see companies like Facebook and Twitter instead adhere to a Chinese standard, much more constraining, let's just stipulate. I know we'll talk a little later about China as well, but just for the moment, that would be an example of a Brussels type effect, except coming from Beijing, if they in fact adhere to that. But your point is right now they're not doing that. They're choosing to follow what's coming out of Europe, not what's coming out of the US or coming out of China.
Exactly.
Okay, fantastic. So one thing I realized, just to back up for a second, I didn't say where your book was published. So let me say it's on Oxford and it came out this year. Is that right? Just a few months ago?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
It is a challenging time to come up with the book, but I got it out right before the pandemic and then the conversation turned. But yeah, so the book came out earlier this year.
Yeah, great. So in terms of the examples that you were just giving, one thing that obviously comes to mind for, I think, a lot of lawyers is one that, in a sense, in the example you just gave about chicken, with different kind of contrasting regulatory requirements, there's a conflict of laws question that arises. And that's sort of one dimension that may or may not be present. And it sounds like oftentimes, if I understood you correctly, when there's no conflict and there's simply a more ambitious standard that's then chosen, that's when the Brussels effect is really in effect. Is that right?
That's right, Kal, yes.
Okay. And when there is a conflict, then I guess I want to know what happens and how, not only what happens empirically when there is such a conflict, but what does that mean for your argument and for the power of whether it's the EU or the United States to regulate? How do we understand that kind of more theoretically?
Yeah, so I think in most instances, the companies that love uniform standards, they love the scale economies, they love to avoid the complications of producing different variants of the products for different markets in order to meet inconsistent regulatory standards. So, and in many instances, they can do that by adhering to the EU standards. So the EU standard does give them the license to operate around the world. But in cases like the example on the chlorine chicken, or the other one could be that the EU's animal welfare regulations prevent the companies from testing cosmetics on animals. But up until recently, at least China has required animal testing to prove that cosmetics are safe. So what does the company do? The company has the option of producing two different variants of the product, two different factories or two different production lines within the factory in order to serve the Chinese market and to serve the European market and typically the rest of the world using the European production line. If this other market is big enough like China, you might see the companies conclude that it is worth their while to retain access to all the markets in the world and produce two different variations of the same product. But often, and to the extent that they can avoid it, they avoid it. And they can either choose the market where they offer their products, or then that's the only way to avoid the cost of compliance. So they may withdraw from some market. Because sometimes it's also very risky, Carl. So if you imagine, for instance, the GMO regulation, the EU is very stringent when it comes to GMO food. And if you
genetically modified organisms.
Exactly, genetically modified food. And if you are a farmer in the United States and you would want to export to Europe and also produce domestically, and you want to have two different fields that you separate, that you have GMOs used in one field but no GMOs on the other, you run the risk that there is cross-pollination and somehow the GMOs get commingled with the non-GMO crop. And then your production is unfit for marketing in Europe. So in many instances, the farmers have chosen to basically avoid GMOs altogether in order just not to even have the risk that their production might then be unsuitable for some of the export markets. So the pressures towards uniformity are very strong. And I think it's more of an exception when you decide then to produce different products for different markets. But of course, in some areas, if you can do it at a reasonable cost, then you can do it. So you can cater to more refined and different consumer preferences in instances where the scale economies are not that overwhelming, or where it is feasible for you to separate your production. I use the term divisibility of production. So when your production is divisible, then Brussels effect doesn't take place. Then the companies are producing different products for different markets.
Right. And you actually lay out a couple of other factors, or I guess they're factors that either promote or don't the Brussels effect. So divisibility is one, and maybe you could just quickly lay out the others.
Yeah, so for the Brussels effect to take place, and it's not a theory about the EU, it's basically a theory of when a single jurisdiction can regulate the global marketplace alone. So if these conditions are present with respect to the US, we should see the Washington effect. If China meets these conditions, then we should see the Beijing effect. So what you need to have is a large consumer market. If you have Costa Rica that is willing to be very ambitious environmental regulator, and those standards are too much for corporations to handle, they just decide not to do business in Costa Rica. But you cannot avoid trading in large markets. So why don't we see the Washington effect or the Beijing effect? They are also large markets. Well, large market is not enough. You also need to have the regulatory capacity. So the legal institutions that help you unleash the power of the market and convert that into tangible regulatory influence. China, for instance, doesn't quite have the institutional framework, the technocratic expertise, and the ability to enforce its regulations. Washington doesn't have that problem. There's plenty of regulatory capacity in Washington. But what is missing there is the third component, the political willingness to deploy that capacity. So that capacity largely sits idle in the DC. There is no federal privacy regulation that would compete with the general data protection regulation. So the market size, the regulatory capacity, the political will to promulgate stringent regulations. And then the two remaining conditions, one is that non-divisibility. So the idea that it is in the interest of the producer to forgo the benefits of taking advantage of lower standards in other markets, and instead of applying a uniform standard. And the last condition is what I call inelasticity or elasticity. So the idea that the single jurisdiction can successfully regulate globally only when it regulates inelastic targets, like the EU regulates consumers, not capital. Capital can move if the regulatory environment is too stringent. But consumers, all these, the data subjects that are regulated by the GDPR, the company cannot avoid the EU regulation by, for instance, processing the data outside of the EU. There is, as long as the EU regulates the environment and the consumers, those are inelastic targets that don't move. So you basically need to have all those 5 elements for there to be the Brussels effect: the market size, regulatory capacity, political will to deploy regulations, inelastic targets, and non-divisible production.
Fantastic. So if the Washington effect were to kick in a little more strongly, it sounds like maybe that might vary based on who's in the White House, for example, or particular parties controlling Congress and being willing to deploy the regulatory capacity the U.S. has. So if we saw that occur, let's say in a couple of years, and we also saw China become more aggressive in building up its capacity and deploying that capacity, we might start to see multiple Brussels-like effects. They're all, you said, conceptually the same. It's just you're talking about the EU happens to empirically be the one that matters right now the most. And you have a particular interest in that, but there's nothing particular about Europe to the story. Is that right?
That's right, Kal. And I think until 1990s, the regulations came from the United States. The US was willing to be the leader on, for instance, environmental regulations. But since then, there's been a political commitment to deregulation. And really, even when we've had Democratic presidents in the White House, the Congress, these issues have become politically very divisive. And it has been very difficult to harness the consensus behind the kind of regulations. So partially it's been the political deadlock surrounding many of these regulations, but also how the procedural commitment to cost-benefit analysis, to scientific, very high levels of scientific proof that are required before the government is willing to intervene. And something that I think the Europeans and Americans are somewhat different in how they think about their faith in the market's ability to self-correct or in the government's ability to intervene in productive ways. And the Europeans have been much more comfortable with the idea that the governments may get it right and governments can improve the market outcomes by intervening with antitrust laws, with privacy laws, with environmental, with food safety regulations, and so forth. But in principle, yes, if we see a move, see a shift in the political landscape, you see calls for more stringent antitrust regulation, for instance. That is a rather new conversation here. We might see that the United States would step back in the game, and then it would be a competing regulator with Brussels.
Right. So if we were to see that, let's talk about that a little bit, because one of the other factors you mentioned that's very significant is market size. So you gave the example of Costa Rica, of course, tiny jurisdiction. EU is very large. But as you point out in the book, the EU's relative economic size, market size, is in fact diminishing fairly rapidly, which is also true of the United States. But the United States remains per capita quite a bit richer. China's obviously has been growing very fast. Other countries are as well. And so if we were to extrapolate 10 years in the future, or 20 years, certainly, we would see a very different landscape in terms of market size. And I know you explore this, but let's just talk a little bit about first of all, what do you see happening in the future as that occurs? And then how does that relate to your arguments? Does it really matter, or does it just mean that the Brussels effect is muted over time as, let's say, the Beijing effect grows over time?
Yeah, so Kal, I think it is absolutely inevitable that Europe's relative size of the global marketplace will go down. And with that, there is a possibility that we also see the Brussels effect being compromised. The fewer are the instances where the companies perceive the European Union to be an unavoidable, inevitable trading destination. The more they have opportunities to trade elsewhere, the less dependent they are on following the Brussels regulations. But the argument I make in the book is not that the EU's market size would not go down. I rather make the argument that the EU's regulatory power will outlive its power measured by GDP alone. And the reason is the following. So first of all, the GDP is a better predictor. The GDP per capita is a better predictor of the jurisdiction's willingness to regulate than the GDP alone. And it is going to be a long while before the Chinese consumers are wealthy enough, before the GDP per capita in China is at the level that there will be a genuine demand for very ambitious regulations. And by the time the Chinese consumers will get there, I'm afraid that the overall GDP growth of China has slowed down to the effect that the government might be hesitant to adopt any regulations that might further dampen that growth. So in that sense, I think there will be a delayed Beijing effect if that effect was to come to existence.
And let me press you on that for a second, just to pause on that example. So you're very much focused on consumer-driven and consumer-protective regulation, but let's just take again online speech. The Chinese government the Communist Party has a strong interest in controlling what's said. That has nothing to do with consumer interests, or for that matter, really GDP per capita. It's a very much a political decision. And they have pretty stringent regulation about technology and the use of technology, social media and other forms because of that. So why isn't that an example of the dynamic that we're talking about? Why does it matter that it has to come from Chinese consumers in some future state in which they're much wealthier?
Well, when we talk about the consumer-driven regulation in the EU, that is something that where the companies are sensitive to the needs of the consumer when they are designing the products globally, and where the preferences of the European consumer allow them to produce products that are still marketable elsewhere. The Chinese preferences when it comes to online speech, it is the kind of online speech that is not marketable elsewhere. But you're right that that's not a consumer-driven a regulation in the sense that China may still go ahead and continue to keep its stringent regulations. But it may just lead to the kind of splinternet, the differences in regulatory environments where we see a different set of companies offer services in China, and we see different technology companies cater to different markets. So in that sense, I think that the Chinese speech is not going to be globalized, the same that Brussels effect is going to be globalized. When I talk about the examples of the Chinese consumers not being wealthy enough, the issues that I had in mind, it affects their willingness to, for instance, demand very stringent product safety regulations, environmental regulations, food safety regulations. And to some extent, they already have been asking for more stringent regulations.
Yes,
but
definitely.
we are far still from the kind of regulation that we are seeing in the EU.
Yeah, agreed. So just to close, we have a little bit of time left. I want to ask, I guess one sort of very much related to what we're talking about is the issue of consumer versus, let's say, business side regulation. So whether it's in high technology where, for example, let's say 5G rollout, where the US is pressuring many countries to adopt or not adopt technology from Chinese companies that directly relates to some standardization choices and regulatory choices, or taxation or other things. Just to clarify, the dynamic that you describe is really about consumer-facing regulations, not kind of business-facing, but it might have implications for business-facing, or is that a totally different world as far as your argument is concerned?
Well, we talk about consumer products, but it's a regulating business when business is offering products to the consumer marketplace. And but if you think about the number of businesses that use data, for instance, as part of their business model, all of that is captured by the European regulation. I think where we don't see the Brussels effect is that when we talk about, for instance, like I mentioned, mobile, elastic targets like capital. So financial regulation is a much harder one, or taxation for Brussels to take a global lead on. So in that sense, yes, it is much more of a consumer-driven regulatory model. which is why if you think about some of the American regulations where the US has been more ambitious was that after financial crisis, there was a tightening of financial regulation, but that follows a different dynamic. And it's not to say that the EU would not care when it comes to digital tax, when it comes to when we talk about labor regulations or human rights regulations that are not about consumer markets. It is just that in those areas, the EU needs to rely on diplomacy, political channels of trying to export its views around the world, because the markets, the business incentives of companies don't do the job for the EU.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So just a couple of last questions, not necessarily related questions, but we talked a few minutes back briefly about the idea of conflicts of law and how that might play out. And I guess one other dimension to this that comes to mind in terms of thinking about the legal implications is, of course, extraterritoriality and the ways in which we might see this dynamic play out through extraterritorial claims of jurisdiction. But it seems like the way you're describing it, and from having read your book, that in fact a lot of this is really not extraterritorial at all. It may have an extraterritorial effect in the sense that businesses outside the territorial jurisdiction choose to follow the regulation, but there isn't an assertion of jurisdiction in the traditional sense. Is that how you see it?
That's right, Kal. And that's why the biggest criticism of the Brussels effect has been, or at least the criticism made on political grounds, is that the EU is a regulatory imperialist. It is compromising the political autonomy of citizens around the world and making regulators in other jurisdictions obsolete and unable to cater to the democratic preferences of their citizens. But at the same time, if you think about what is the EU's response to this, the EU says, we are exercising our sovereign right to regulate our own market. And if a global company then decides to apply the EU rules globally and serve markets in India and Brazil and the United States and China with those same products, that is not us imposing our regulations. That is not us engaging in extraterritorial enforcement of our laws. So what we rather see is the companies' voluntary change in their global business behavior, where we see the rules come from Brussels, but the rules that are intended for regulating the European market, and then voluntarily taken on by the corporations for around the world. And sometimes we see that foreign governments around the world also then emulate these regulations around the world. So if you think about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations we've talked about, there are over 100 countries now around the world, the governments that have adopted a GDPR-style regulation domestically as well. That's not to say that the EU is engaged in extraterritorial enforcement or extraterritorial regulation.
No, it's more like it's exporting its regulatory rules and maybe approach to other places who are happily adopting it, but doing so voluntarily.
Yeah, and some of them may be reluctantly, but in the end, it is in the interest of these companies. They may not love the Brussels rule as the best rule in the world, but they still conclude that it is in their business interest. They are better off with one global rule than a bunch of different rules coming from different jurisdictions. And often then they lobby their own governments to adopt those same rules as well, so they can level the playing field domestically vis-a-vis the competitors that would not be exporting to Europe and that would not be subject to those stringent regulations. But that dynamic that exports those rules, that is already further removed from Brussels itself. That is still focused on regulating the single market.
One thing I think we also did mention, which is important, and I think you agree with this, is that large companies, very large companies, which really is what we're focused on in this discussion, often are fans of stringent regulation if it's expensive to implement, because it gives them a competitive advantage. They're able to do it. Smaller companies are not. And so paradoxically, they sometimes welcome it.
Yeah, and this is something, Kal, that I do have a concern to some extent of the distributional impact of the EU regulation, because the EU regulators' discomfort with the powerful companies dominating the market is well known. And that explains partially all the antitrust cases against Google, for instance, for allegedly abusing that dominant position. But there is a criticism that I think is valid, that, for instance, the GDPR is the type of regulation that is particularly costly for the small companies that cannot afford to comply with those stringent regulatory environments. It is not hard for Google. It is not hard for Facebook. It is not hard for Apple to follow the European rules in that respect. And that is something I think when the EU starts reevaluating its approach, it needs to take a hard look of the differential impact of its regulations on small versus large companies.
Agreed. Well, this has been a terrific discussion, Anu, and I'm really glad we were able to talk about your book. Again, it's called The Brussels Effect on Oxford University Press. And I really want to thank you for coming on the podcast. And I want to thank the listeners for listening in. And please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to podcasts. So, Anu, thanks again so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure, Kal.